All right. Okay, so we're pleased to have with us today Dr. Christina Aperjis from Hewlett-Packard Labs. I was surprised to find from her, I'm interested since she was a student, that they have a group that is interested in social networks and economic networks there. So she got her bachelor's from the same place I did, National University of Athens, Greece, in 2003. And then she got her master's degree from Columbia and her PhD degree from Stanford. And she is currently a researcher with the social computing group at the Hewlett-Packard Labs in Palo Alto. Today she will talk to us about bilateral and multilateral exchanges for peer-assisted content distribution.
And thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to visit Maryland. So this talk is joint work with Ramesh, who was my advisor at Stanford, and Mike Freedman, who is now at Princeton. He's a professor in computer science there. This talk is about peer-assisted content distribution, and by that I mean peer-to-peer systems which users can use to share files with each other. So peer-assisted content distribution is an efficient way to share files between users, and they work well if usually actually share their files and their resources with the system. However, early studies about 10 years ago, actually in 2000, there was a study that showed that early peer-to-peer systems were not working that well because people were actually not sharing their upload capacity with the system. So there was this free riding problem. And this first study was on Nutella. And then later there was another study in 2005 that showed that even more users were not sharing their files. So since then there has been a lot of work in trying to incentivize people to share files and upload capacity with the system. The most popular peer-to-peer system today, which is probably the one that is one of the most successful ones with respect to incentives, is BitTorrent. And BitTorrent incentivizes exchange in a bilateral way. In particular, it is in the protocol that as a peer, I will look at which peers send me the highest rates, and I will split my upload capacity between those peers. So this means that the more the peer sends me, potentially the more it will get from me. But by sending me more, it will not get more from someone else. So this is the bilateral nature of the system. So this comes to this observation that the prevalent peer-to-peer systems today, like BitTorrent and Inspirants, are bilateral. And in this talk, I will consider an abstraction of this. So I will say that downloading is possible in return for uploading the same user. Now this is nice, and this is simple, and it's done very nicely in the BitTorrent protocol. But there can be some problems with it. And the problem is that I can only exchange with someone if he has a file that I want, and I have a file that he wants. Otherwise, exchange is not possible. And actually, that's a problem of bilateral exchange or barter that is known in economics, because many early economies were like this. Like it was a barter economy. And the solution to this in modern economies is to have money. And money is a medium of exchange, which lets people, so people buy something from someone, pay money, this money can be used to buy something else later. So this is what we call here multilateral exchange, which is just what the normal economy is doing, which allows users to trade in more general ways. The problem, so we could use these ideas in a peer-to-peer system, just have a virtual currency in the system and say, whenever you download something, you pay something for it in this virtual currency. When you upload, you get paid. The problem is that it's complex to implement this in a peer-to-peer system because you need some type of bank, some way to secure currency. So we can see that there is a trade-off with respect to the design of the systems. We can either do something like bilateral exchange, which is simple, but has these problems of participation, or use multilateral exchange, which enables much more participation from the point of view of peers, but it's not as simple. And this is what is the focus of this talk. I will do this comparison between bilateral and multilateral exchange in two ways. First, I will compare them in terms of the efficiency of equilibria that arise. And I will define in a few slides what I mean by equilibria in this case. And then I will do a more quantitative comparison, where I look at the percentage of peers that can trade in each type of exchange. Before getting into the details of the model, let me make some general observations about our approach. So I already make the connection with an economy. In general, we can view content exchange as an economy, and then we can talk about demand and supply. Demand, demand, by demand here I mean the download request for content. And on the other hand, supply will be scarce system resources like the upload capacity of peers or the files they have and so on. Now, what files do peers have? So we take a snapshot, the view of the system. It's a static approach. And we focus on a time scale over which the set of files that people have or want does not change. So we don't consider the system over days, but over minutes. And consistent with this snapshot view of the system, we will consider the rates that people upload and download, as opposed to considering bytes. If the rates are constant for a short period of time, of course we can translate from one to the other, but in this talk I will be talking about rates. And finally, with respect to the network, I will only consider the upload constraint of peers, and not other constraints that could arise in the network. So now let me introduce some notation. Let's say we have two peers, I and J. We denote by R, J, F, the rate at which peer I uploads file F to peer J. Given such rates, now we can define DIF to be the total download rate of peer I for file F. That's what the peer cares about. He wants to get high download rates. And we can also define the upload rate of a peer by Q sub I, just by summing the corresponding rates. Now, a peer has preferences over what he wants to download and how much he wants to upload. These preferences can be measured by a utility function, which is this function VI for peer I, which depends on the vector of download rates of a peer and his upload rate. In general, the peer wants to download faster, so his utility will be increasing in each download rate of files that he's interested in, and decreasing his upload rate, because that's the resources he's consuming to share with the system. In terms of constraints, I already mentioned that the constraint we're considering is the upload constraint of a peer. So by VI here, we denote the bandwidth of a specific user. The user cannot upload more than that, at a higher rate than that. And now we can define X to be the set of feasible rate vectors. This is just the rate vectors such that no peer is uploading more than his bandwidth, and no peer is uploading a file he doesn't have. Just very straightforward feasibility here. Now let's define bilateral content exchange. I already mentioned that this is happening on a pairwise basis. Basically, I send something to you and you send something back to me. So we can define Rij to be the rate at which peer I is uploading to peer J. And then, given such rates between a pair of peers, we can define the exchange ratio at which they're exchanging. So the exchange ratio between peers I and J is given by the ratio of the rate that I gets from J over the rate that I sends to J. So this exchange ratio shows how much rate I gets from J per unit of upload rate that I sends to J. This is an exchange, yes?
Just to clarify, so are you assuming all these exchanges are taking place at the same time? So only the two users that are uploading downloading files with each other can...
But there could be, so a user can be participating with multiple exchanges at the same time, which is what happens in systems like BitTorrent.
No, I guess the question I was getting is, suppose I'm one of the users. I just downloaded some file from you.
Yes.
And I may be willing to actually let you access one of the files in my local directory. But this exchange may not happen at the same time.
Yeah, so now we are considering exchanges that happen at the same time. So at the same time, so this is the static approach I mentioned before. You're sending some rate to me, I'm sending some rate to you, and we just consider these rates.
This is in files per unit time, no?
This is in, let's say, bits per second. This is what
So it's in bits per second.
bits per second. That's why I'm talking about rates here.
You're assuming that every link has different capacity?
No, the capacity of the link is the constraints I'm considering are the upload capacities of peers, which is upper bounded by the bandwidth of the peer, which is what I denote by BI.
And it's the total upload. I mean, for example, if you want to send to many people, you share your bandwidth to all of them.
Yeah, so let's say that my bandwidth is 10, then I can be uploading 7 to you and 2 to you, that's fine, because it satisfies the constraint. I cannot be uploading 7 to you and 7 to someone else. That would
Bounding the actual physical link, or is this only virtual?
I mean, it could be the connection I have at home that it only allows me a total bandwidth, a total upload rate of 10, let's say.
So it has to amplify the question put earlier, whether it's possible for a particular file on its way out to actually be destined for several destinations.
Yeah, so we do not consider that. We,
Let's not consider that.
yes. Yes, we consider that this is a joint constraint on all the files a joint constraint with respect to everyone else you are uploading to. Okay? So we define these exchange ratios between peers. Now, we have not talked about prices yet, but we could picture a setting where there are prices. We are considering this exchange between peers I and J. And let's say that price Pij is the price that peer I charges to peer J, and price Pji is the price that peer J charges to peer I. So then, since these peers are exchanging with each other and they don't exchange any money, basically the exchange is settlement free, we would expect this to hold. So so the price that I charges J times the rate that he sends you should be equal to what J charges I times the rate that J sends to I. So with this interpretation, even though we don't assume that these prices exist there, but we can see that the exchange ratio could be given by a ratio of these two prices. Now, note that here the price has two subscripts, both I and J. The price depends on the specific pair. So in general, the price that I charges J can be different than the price that I charges to some other peer K. This is as if peers are price discriminating. They're not charging to everyone else the same price. And that, as we'll see later, is what is the main drawback of bilateral exchange in terms of equilibrium. I already mentioned the example of BitTorrent. And what BitTorrent, yes?
Sorry, there's no values attached to any of these files or objects that you're exchanging.
So the value comes from this utility function.
Right, but those are not attached to the file. These are derived from the rates at which you're uploading or downloading.
But this depends on a vector of rates.
Right.
And there will be one entry for each file you're interested in. So maybe you value some file more than another one.
Okay.
And that will come from this utility function.
Only through the rate.
Through the rate, yes. So maybe you want to download one file faster than another, and that's where it comes the utility function. So in BitTorrent, as I mentioned before, a peer splits its upload rate equally among all peers in its active set. And then we can define what so let's say among KJ peers, then we can see exactly what the formula for the exchange ratio will be in this case. Now let me go to multilateral content exchange, the one where there is money which enables the exchanges between peers. So here we have a virtual currency, and then there's a price associated with each peer. So the downloading from peer J costs Pj per unit rate. So note that this is similar to the prices I mentioned before in the bilateral exchange, but now but now there's no price discrimination. Peer J charges the same price to everyone else. And this is actually similar to what is called in economics an exchange economy, where it's basically a model of an economy without production. And people come to the market with some endowment, and then they exchange that, and there are some prices that clear the market, and these prices are the equilibrium. It's not exactly the same setting here because we have this joint constraint on the bandwidth, but the ideas are similar. So now, similar to what is done in economics with respect to equilibria, let's define the equilibrium here. Given a set of prices, given a vector of prices, each peer can find its optimal rate allocation. So a peer will try to maximize its utility, subject to the constraint that, well, the rate allocation is feasible. That is what X denotes. And then we have this additional constraint here in the middle, which basically says that you don't, whatever you earn by selling things has to exceed what you have to pay to others. And that's exactly what the constraint says. Similar to this, we can define the problem of bilateral exchange in a setting where instead of optimizing with respect to prices, you optimize with respect to exchange ratios. So the optimization problem is very similar. The only thing that changes is this budget constraint. Now, instead of having to balance your total budget, the total budget you have to pay, the total amount you have to pay versus the total amount you get from others, you have to balance this on a pairwise basis. So
Each I does either one of these problems? Is that what you mean?
yes. So I'm saying that as in a standard economy, the assumption is that each person is doing this optimization, and then we find prices that clear the market. So similarly, we can do that in a bilateral exchange. Each peer will do this optimization, and then we'll find exchange ratios that clear the market again. But it's a very similar approach. So at an equilibrium, all users have optimized, have solved these optimization problems, and the market clears. So in the case of a multilateral exchange, an equilibrium consists of a rate allocation and a price vector, such that given this price, so here we have this rate allocation R star and the price vector P star. This is an equilibrium. If when the prices are P star, then R star solves this optimization problem for all peers. And similarly, we can do that for bilateral exchange. Again, can define an equilibrium which consists of a rate vector and a vector of exchange ratios, such that given these exchange ratios, when all peers solve this problem, R star is optimal for all of them.
And what are those mild conditions?
So concavity, and that it's increasing in basically the utility is increasing in the rates, decreasing in the
rate.
Sorry.
Increasing in download.
In download rates, decreasing in upload rate, and that the derivative at zero is not infinite.
Sorry, just to clarify, decreasing in upload rate or non-increasing in upload rate?
Well, increasing in the ones that you want to download. So there's a set of files that you're interested in.
Yeah.
In that set, it should be increasing. And in other sets, in other files that you're not interested in downloading, there's no dependence. There will be no dependence.
Okay.
Okay, so, well, I mean, you read it without me saying it. Basically, under my conditions, both types of equilibrium exist. And now let's go to talk about efficiency. By efficiency here, I mean Pareto efficiency. And allocation is Pareto efficient if it's not possible to find an improvement at which some users' utility is improved, but no one else is worse off. So that's just a very standard way to define efficiency in economics. And the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics says that multilateral equilibria are Pareto efficient. So we have this basic efficiency property for multilateral exchange. On the other hand, bilateral equilibria are not always Pareto efficient. So the question is when, but they are in some cases, so the question is when are bilateral equilibria efficient? And our main result in this part of the talk is that a bilateral equilibrium is efficient if and only if it corresponds to multilateral equilibrium. more specifically, I mean that a bilateral equilibrium, which is given by a rate, a vector of exchange ratios, and a rate allocation, is Pareto efficient, even only if there exists a supporting vector of prices, such that given those prices and the rate allocation of the bilateral equilibrium, we have a multilateral equilibrium. Now, okay, the one direction of this is fairly straightforward to show, the if part. In particular, if this bilateral equilibrium allocation corresponds to a multilateral equilibrium, well, that we already know that multilateral equilibria are efficient, so this shows one direction of the theorem. The other part is more difficult to show, and I will give a sketch in the next couple of slides. Before going there, I just want to mention the assumption of this theorem. Basically, it says that the utility approaches minus utilities as upload rates approach capacity or the bandwidth. We only need this assumption to make sure that at the bilateral equilibrium, peers are not operating at the capacity. So as long as that is not the case, then we can show this. So let's go to the proof. In general, I don't show proofs in house, but I'm going to show this one because it shows an interesting connection between the equilibria we're talking about here and Markov chains. So what do we want to show? We want to start with a Pareto efficient bilateral equilibrium, which will be given by exchange ratios gamma star and the rate allocation R star. We want to show that there exists a price vector, P star, such that P star and R star is a multilateral equilibrium. And to do that, we will explain the connection between this type of equilibria and reversible Markov chains. And to see where the chain comes from, let's define Rij star to be the total rate from pure I to pure J, the bilateral equilibrium. And we define the diagonal elements Rii star in such a way such that the sum of each row is equal to 0. So now we have a rate matrix. So R star is the rate matrix of a continuous time Markov chain. And let's suppose first that it's irreducible. The proof extends to the more general case. It's an irreducible Markov chain. Let's denote its invariant distribution by P here. And I said there will be a connection with reversibility. Let's assume that this chain is reversible. Then by the detailed balance conditions, we see this. So essentially we see that the exchange ratio between I and J is given by the ratio of Pi over Pj. Now these P's come from the invariant distribution, but we could also look at them as prices. So basically, in this case, there are prices such that every peer charges one price to everyone else. And actually, these prices solve the multilateral optimization problem. With these prices, R star solves the multilateral optimization problem of each peer. So basically, we're done in this case. We have shown that if the chain is reversible, then there is this equivalence between bilateral and multilateral equilibrium. So let's go now to the case that R star is not reversible. Then the detailed balance conditions will not hold for this one pair of peers. And then we can find a pair such that the ratio, we still assume that the vector P is the invariant distribution. So we can find a pair I and J such that the ratio of Pi over Pj is greater than that exchange ratio. Essentially, this means that peer I overpaid to transact with peer J. And we can follow this argument and find, so because of the budget balance condition here, we can find, since I overpaid to transact with J, there will be another peer J prime such that I underpaid to transact with J prime, or in other words, J prime overpaid to transact with I. So we can follow this this again and again until we come back to the same peer. And we basically find a cycle of peers such that each peer overpaid to transact with the next one in the cycle. So let's say the cycle only consists of 3 peers. One overpaid to 2, 2 overpaid 3, 3 overpaid 1. So now we can increase the rates in the other direction of the cycle and make everyone better off. So we find a Pareto improvement. So basically we have shown that if R star is not reversible, then the allocation is not Pareto efficient. So in other words, if R star is a Pareto efficient bilateral equilibrium, then R star, the matrix is reversible. Yes.
We are assuming that you're starting with a bilateral equilibrium. So what
Yes.
do you mean by I overpaying J? Because if I feels that it's overpaying J, then it wouldn't be an equilibrium.
Well, yes, at the equilibrium, it's not overpaying it because P is optimized with respect to these ratios gamma and J. But it's overpaying compared to the prices it would have paid if the prices were given by the invariant distribution. That's what I mean. So in the case where we had Pareto efficiency, we saw that the prices matched, the price at the bilateral equilibrium and the
There
invariant
is a better
distribution.
operating point for I compared to them at the equilibrium is overpaying.
Yes. So one example, one simple example. One simple example you can think of. So in this case that we have these three peers, let's say that each peer likes two files. So each peer has one file, and each peer wants to download the other two. And let's say that peer 2 wants more the file that is given by 3. But because of bilateral equilibrium, we cannot do this. We cannot do this type of exchange by considering what all peers want. We can only do it at a pairwise basis, so that we get this type of inefficiencies. Okay. So this basically showed the idea of the proof for the case of an irreducible chain. In general, it will not be irreducible, but then it will contain many connected components, the Markov chain. So to complete the proof, we can consider supporting price vectors that are linear combinations of the invariant distributions that we get for the different components. If it's not possible to get the linear combination that corresponds to the multilateral equilibrium, then we can find a Pareto improvement by again looking at the circle of peers that can trade on some direction and prove everything. But now this cycle may be spanning multiple connected components. Okay, so that concludes the first part of the talk, which compared the two types of exchanges in terms of equilibrium. Just to summarize, we have seen that bilateral equilibria are not always Pareto efficient and are Pareto efficient if and only if they correspond to multilateral equilibrium. So this is, let's say, an axiomatic characterization of the two types of exchange. But it's also kind of a binary comparison, because we say bilateral equilibria are not efficient, multilateral are. But it doesn't say how much worse one is from the other. So to look at a more quantitative comparison, we look at the participation. So the question on the second part of the talk is how many peers are able to trade bilaterally or multilaterally and compare these numbers. And to do that, we will use a random model to quantify the density of trade produced by the two models. We will use a random model for the preferences that peers have in the system. So going back to the definitions of bilateral and multilateral exchange, we can say that the peer can trade bilaterally if it has some complementary peer in the system. So basically, some other peer in the system has a file that I want and wants a file that I have. Then I can participate in bilateral exchange. Similarly, to participate in multilateral exchange, I should be part of a circle of peers along which these peers want to trade. So in particular, there can be extreme cases where even with multilateral exchange, I cannot participate. Let's say I have a file that no one else in the system wants, and that's the only file I have. Well, no one will want to trade with me even multilaterally. So there could be, even for multilateral exchange that is much more general than bilateral, there could be cases that some peers though cannot trade. So peer-to-peer systems are generally large, a lot of users, a lot of files. So it makes sense to look at an asymptotic analysis of the system. To do that, let's say that we have n users and k files, and each user wants to upload one file and wants to download one file. So we restrict the set that peers run and have just to one file. And now we want to consider a specific distribution for the popularity of different files. Let's consider the zip distribution, which essentially says that we can rank the files, the most popular, the second most popular, the third most popular, and so on. So now the F most popular file is going to be demanded with the probability proportional to F to the minus S. Well, one extreme case is that the exponent S is the parameter here of the distribution. And one extreme case is when the exponent is equal to 0, where essentially we have the uniform distribution. All files are desired or possessed with equal probability. Now, as S increases, as the exponent increases, the distribution becomes more and more concentrated. So the metric we're going to use to compare the two types of exchange is the expected proportion of users that cannot participate. So the smaller, the better, basically. Let's look first at the case that S, the exponent of the zip distribution, is less than 1. So we have kind of a long tail of things, basically. This includes the uniform distribution, but also more concentrated distributions, but not something extremely concentrated. And we denote by rho ME the expected number of unmatched peers in multilateral exchange, and similarly rho BE the expected number of unmatched peers in bilateral exchange. So these are going to be two proportions between 0 and 1, and the closer to 0 the better. Of course, multilateral exchange is always better than bilateral, so rho ME is always smaller than rho BE, but we want to see how much smaller. And we have these three different results. So again, we're in the case of the zip exponent smaller than 1. If the number of users in the system scales faster than the square of the number of files in the system, then bilateral exchange performs very well. So the proportion of peers that cannot trade bilaterally asymptotically goes to 0. And goes to infinity. So
is K necessarily
K not necessarily, but of course the larger the K is, the worse for the system, for the performance of both types of exchange. And basically, I mean, I'm not being very rigorous here, but we have parameterized K to can depend on N. So basically, when the limit of N over K squared goes to infinity, as N goes to infinity, then we have the first result. On the other hand, if the number of peers in the system scales slower than the square of the number of files, this is the second case here, then bilateral exchange does not perform well. So basically, asymptotically, we have that the proportion of peers that cannot trade bilaterally is lower bounded by this constant, by 1 minus S squared.
Can you go back to the slide where you had the setup?
This one?
Yes. So when K squared is much, much larger than N, what does that mean?
When there are many more files than
Right,
users,
users.
well then both types of exchange are harder. Basically, let's say that we are only 20 users, but there are hundreds of files. Then it's very unlikely that I will have a file that someone else wants. It's very likely to find a match.
But that doesn't seem like the shortcoming of bilateral exchange. That's
Well,
just-
both will perform bad in that setting.
Right.
So this, I mean, I didn't finish. There's the third line, which talks about multilateral. So you're right. There are some settings that neither will perform well. But we're interested in settings that multilateral performs well and bilateral does not. Did you have a question? No?
So S is an arbitrary parameter, right?
Sorry?
S can have an arbitrary value.
Yes. Well,
If it's during one.
And there is a proportion, that row is a proportion.
Yes.
Yes, param characterizes the zip flow, the table.
The proportion is between 0 and 1, right?
Yes.
So if S is 10,
No, in this case, we only consider the case that S is smaller than 1 on this slide. The next slide will consider the case.
Is there any general relationship between row and B and row B?
It's always smaller. The rho M is always smaller than rho B. And now here we gave the specific properties. So, okay, let's go to the third part of this theorem. This says, remember, K is the number of files. So this says if K log K scales slower than the number of users in the system, then multilateral exchange performs very well. In the sense, again, that the proportion goes to 0 as the number of users goes to infinity. So basically, combining the second and third part, we see this conclusion. If the number of users scales faster than K log K, but slower than K squared, then we're in this setting where multilateral is significantly better than bilateral.
So in practice, I guess we'll come to that. In practice, can you verify it in the case?
And I'll show you later a bit data set from Bitcoin. So, any questions about this? So let's move to the next slide, which is the case that S is greater than 1. This is a very concentrated distribution. And in this case, the result is that bilateral performs very well. So for any scaling of the number of files and the number of users in the system, the proportion of peers that cannot shrink bilaterally goes to 0 when the system becomes large.
The actual factors are very popular.
Exactly. So exactly, that's the intuition, that there is a high concentration of popularity in a small number of files. Most people want and have those files, so most people are able to match. So, and actually this, even though I said we restrict attention to one, peers having one file and wanting one file, this result holds more general when peers have multiple files. Of course, the more files peers have, the better it is for the matching. The more likely the matching is.
Is there something missing here about what do you say about the distribution of files among the users in relation to their desirability?
So that's so here I'm not considering the utility function anymore. The utility function, I looked at it for the equilibria, but here that's why I restricted attention to the setting where each peer has one file and wants one file, and I'm just considering if it's possible to find a match for him in the system.
What happens if I have multiple files?
They only have one file.
Yes. So this sorry. Yeah, here each user has one file and wants one file.
But what
No.
happens if I have many files and I have a distribution?
So
Is
for
that more realistic?
I mean, you're right. For the more files you have, the better it is for both types of exchange, because the more likely matches are. We have shown that this result holds also when people have multiple files, and for the case that S is equal to 0 for the uniform distribution. It's hard to show this result in the general case, but in that case we can also show how the improvement in performance depends on the number of files, and it's actually roughly quadratic. So
You get similar difference between the RDE and the RME, even if you have multiple files?
for the case that S equals to 0 for the uniform distribution, that's the only one we have shown for this case when S is smaller than 1. For the case that S is greater than 1, we can show the same result when people have multiple
Even for
files.
multiple files.
Yes, exactly.
But in between, no.
In between, no, we don't know.
But this is the case where you have high likeness. There's a small number of files that are pretty light,
Yes.
even if they have multiple files. And the other one is they don't prepare it. In those, you have the same results. If S is 0, it has bigger than 1.
Yes.
And the one, I don't have any preferences, and the other, I have very clear
Oh,
preferences.
yes. I mean, so there are two things. One is what the files peers have and want,
Yeah.
and the other is what I described before as preferences when I talked about the utility function.
Okay. That's what I mean.
You mean here that what files people want? Yes.
So maybe I'm missing something, but you say that each user have one file and wants one file.
Yes.
So that fixed K, no? The number of files is fixed in this setting. No?
It's not fixed. So So the way we do it, let's say each one has one file and wants one file.
Right.
The probability, this is a random model. So I will choose which file to want with some probability. The probability that I will choose file I will be proportional to I to the minus s. And now k comes in the denominator, because in order to scale this to be a probability, it will be divided by the sum of j to the minus s from j equals to 1 to k.
So you have a pool of files, and user will pick which file to like with this
Exactly, yes.
probability by the
Yes.
When users have a multiple files, the probability of having a matching will depend on the distribution of the number of files each node has.
Yes, and in the theoretical analysis, okay, let's go first to this result, which is the easiest one. Here we show that S is greater than 1, then bilateral exchange performs very well asymptotically. Even if you have more files, but maybe you have 5 files, I have 2, this will only help the system. Since it goes to 0 anyway, it will go to 0 again, even if we have different number of files each. In this case, I said we have shown the result for the case S equals to 0 and people having multiple files. Here we assume that each user has the same number of files in the system and wants the same number of files.
And you use the same probability to like a file and to
Yes.
have a file. So
Yes,
you said-
exactly.
Is it realistic?
So yeah, I mean, you could think of settings where it's not the same. Some of the results still hold. Like for example, for the case that S is greater than 1, then even if they're drawn from different distribution, as long as they both have an exponent that's greater than 1, we still have this result. So basically the conclusion from this discussion is that we can identify regimes where bilateral performs very well compared to almost as well as multilateral. So in this case, there's no reason to have the complicated virtual currency thing. On the other hand, we have also found a regime, this case that the number of users scales faster than k log n but slower than k squared, where bilateral doesn't perform that well. So then maybe in this regime we would want to do something else.
Notice that we voted in case S equals 1. Agree?
Yes, well we couldn't show exactly what happens in that case. But so from here we see that this result would suggest doesn't say anything. Where S equals to 1 just says it's greater or equal to 0. So we would have to we would try to do analysis specifically for S equal to 1, but we didn't show it. Okay, so now let's go to some data from Bilateral. This is a data set we got from Michael Calif in his conference. And it is a large data set. It has 1.4 million downloads, almost 700,000 files, 700,000 peers, and about 7,000 files. And this is what the distribution looks like in a log-log plot. So we see that at the beginning it is it can be approximated by a straight line, but after some point there is this cutoff here. So the zip distribution, even though it seems to fit well, at the beginning it doesn't fit well in the whole sample. Now, another thing we can, we cannot, but at the beginning it seems to be the slope is small. So if it was a zip distribution, it would have an exponent that's smaller than 1. So we're in the case, the more difficult one for bilateral exchange. And of course, we cannot exactly say this like rigorously, but let's look at the number of peers and the number of files and see if we can say something with respect to the asymptotic results. Here we're actually in a regime where the number of the number of peers is between k log n and k squared, where k is the number of files. So this is the regime where bilateral doesn't perform well and multilateral performs well. Okay, that's some general observations. Now we'll go to analyzing using specifically the distributions from the data set to plot some graphs. And again, we're interested in comparing bilateral and multilateral exchange. Recall that rho BE and rho ME are the proportions of peers that cannot trade bilaterally with each type of exchange. And this, so this graph shows these percentages as a function of the number of users. I said that the number of users in the system was about 700,000. Now we vary this in our simulations, but we keep the number of files fixed. So the number of files is about 7,000. We keep that fixed, and we vary the number of users. This note here that here we have the times 10 to the 5th. So basically, this is 200,000 or 100,000 up to 1 million users. And we see that in this range, multilateral performs much better than bilateral. There's a big gap. So now the question is, how can we improve that? Yes.
Can you look? This is the proportion, the y-axis is the proportion of peers that can exchange?
That cannot.
That cannot
For which there's no match.
Okay, so if I have a million other users out there and I can only exchange with 0.1% of them,
You will count as being able to exchange.
I'm happy or unhappy? Oh, I can exchange. So it's the portion who can exchange with anyone.
Exactly, yes.
Wow, okay.
So, but this is assuming that, as I assume in asymptotic analysis, that every peer runs and has one file. So we look at the distribution from this graph, we sample the files that peers want and have, and then we see how many of them can match with someone else.
That's how you allocate files to the user, so you could say if they match or not.
Exactly, yes.
You use the distribution and you randomly allocate.
Yes.
Does it really match up with the data you see, the transactions between different parties?
So, well, okay, these both models are an abstraction of what happens in torrent exactly. So we just use the data set to look at the distribution of how many times different files are downloaded in order to get a sense for how popular different files are.
This I you have here is different, but it's the same program.
So this is the rank. So basically the most popular file, the second most popular, the third.
That's all.
Yes, but it is a logarithmic scale.
Yeah.
And then the horizontal, sorry, the vertical axis is how many times that file was downloaded from the data set.
Let's go to the next slide.
Yes.
So here, if you really compare these two plots, the bilateral exchange case is the case where you limit the size of the cycle to 2.
Yes.
So as you increase the size of the maximum, maximum size of the cycle, where the multilateral case is united to infinity.
Yes.
How does this plot change?
Okay, that's exactly what I will show you in the next slide. Good transition. Basically here, we look at what we call trilateral exchange, where peers can trade in triangles. And you see that there's a big improvement in terms of the convergence. So just to be clear, the red line here, which is the bilateral exchange, will eventually converge to 0 after a very long time, because we're keeping the number of files fixed and we're increasing the number of users. But we see that the
Very slow.
trilateral exchange converges much faster.
It's very slow with respect to the increase of the users.
The bilateral one, yes. And the trilateral converges much faster here. And we actually have some theoretical results for the convergence of the trilaterals with the paper. So that's one way to improve things, right? By instead of considering cycles of 2, by considering bigger cycles. And it seems that 3 does pretty well in this case. So recall that the number of users in the system is about here, so that performs well. Another.
Can you tell us the intuition behind it? Why is it that if I try to match up with a guy that has something I want, but if I bring another person as a middleman, that changes dramatically?
Well, it's just that there are many more exchanges that are possible now.
More people you can match them.
I don't have.
Why is such a dramatic?
Why so dramatic? I don't have an intuition as to why exactly 3 works. I mean, of course, we would expect that it would be an improvement, but that's what the graph shows, that the convergence is much faster in this case.
Why is it works or why?
Yeah, so
Why
why
does-
is that 3 is kind of matching?
It's dramatic in large scale.
Then this is
Well, I mean, the policy immediately lines, you can put that.
this is not log scale here.
No, it's not.
It's I mean it's linear. 200,000, 400,000.
Not only that, I mean, if SE is somewhere between 0 and 1, that the top floor will not be reached to 0, so it's not a quantitative difference.
So
Qualitative.
you asking why I go from this dramatic slowness up
Well,
there?
why is 2 bad, but 3 is just a job.
Okay.
I mean, I was gonna, there is small observation of people like David State and those projects, wireless
Right.
mobility. You need one more relay node to.
There's also similar observations why the cycles of degree 3
Right.
are very important for routing purposes.
Right.
There's something about degree 3 that propagates frequently in the domain.
So what's so magical about it?
I don't know. But there are similar results of this type for other problems totally unrelated to this problem.
Actually, I would like to see these papers you are mentioning. I don't know about them.
Yeah.
Do they? But it seems none of these papers gives the intuition about why it works.
I'm not smart enough to extract it, so.
Okay.
Okay, so that's one way to improve things by looking at cycles of 3. Another way, as we discussed before, is to look at peers having more files, because then there are more potential matches. And this is what we do in this
What
one.
happens if I allow this matching to happen over different periods of time?
Yeah, so that would
Because then I can have bilateral that is in different people. And effectively I can have over time trilateral or quadrilateral.
So are you thinking that the set of files that peers having one change over
Because
time?
we exchange it once.
Yes.
Now I have more.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, I think this dynamic aspect of things is very interesting. We
Right.
haven't done any theoretical work on it. We have done some simulations in another paper.
Now with the
where-
spreading of the likeness that I may be able to match changes if I allow myself more cycles with one cycle.
Yes, I think, I mean, there are many issues related to that. I will talk a bit about it then, about how preferences change over time. In general, old content is not that much interesting to people, and then they're more interested in newer things, and all these can affect the performance of the system.
Well, there was a question, I was thinking, I don't know if that was your question, but what if you retrade files, that is after you.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
That's what you asked.
Yeah, over time. Yeah. And what are you showing here now?
So this, so here we consider the case that peers share more files, not just one. So the red line on top is the same one we had in the previous graph, where each peer has one file. And here n is the number of files that the peer is sharing. So we look at m being 1, 2, 5, 10, and 20. And again, we see dramatic improvement.
And
So
you
that's-
still want one file.
Sorry?
You have 20 files,
And they
but
want
you
one.
want one.
Yes. Of course, if they wanted more, I mean, when they want more, it's not that clear how to define a match. Because is it that you find someone, you can find all the files you want somewhere, or just one? So there are variable, there are different definitions we could use for that. That's why we focus on the number of files that people have. I think that's more intuitive what it means. So, just as an example, let's say that our objective is to have at most 10% of peers that cannot trade. So when we have, so in this case, when we have 20 files per peer, here we would just need 50,000 users to achieve this metric. For when we have 10 files per peer, we would need about 200,000 users. And when we have 5 peers, we would need almost 1 million users to get to 10%. And of course, for 1 and 2 files, the convergence is much slower. So that's a big improvement here by sharing more files. Another question is, how does this type of performance depend on the distribution of how many files different people share? So here we're assuming that all peers share the same number of files. And in general, this is not the case. So we're interested in looking at how, whether a more dispersed distribution is better or worse for bilateral change. And at first we thought maybe a more dispersed distribution with the same mean would actually help, because then you have this, with these peers that have a lot of files, maybe they're able to accommodate a lot of trades, but then we found that this was not true. So here's how we did it. We used again the data set and looked at how many files different peers downloaded. We call this the distribution D, and the mean number of files that different peers downloaded was 2, just above 2. But it had a very high variance. So I think more than 60% of peers only downloaded 1 file in the data set. But then there were some peers, very few, that downloaded more than 400 files. So we had this very dispersed distribution. And this graph shows the red line and the green line are the same as before. Again, just to remind you, the horizontal axis is the number of users, the vertical axis is the performance of bilateral exchange. Smaller is better. And we can compare the distribution for the number of files that different people have from the data set with what happens in the case that everyone has 2 files. This is the green line here, because they have the same mean. And so the black line, which is the distribution from the data set, is worse than the green line. So even though there are these peers that download so many files and can accommodate or have so many files to share and can accommodate a lot of trade, the reason we have this worse performance is that there are many more peers that only have 1 file. So for the majority of peers, things seem to become worse. So these were the main things I wanted to cover. Just to summarize, bilateral equilibrium. So first we did the comparison of bilateral and multilateral exchange in terms of equilibrium. A bilateral equilibrium may not be quite efficient. A multilateral equilibrium is always efficient. And we had this main result that a bilateral equilibrium is quite efficient if and only if it corresponds to a multilateral equilibrium. Then we compared the percentage of peers that cannot participate in both bilateral and multilateral exchange asymptotically and through the data set of the BitTorrent. And we see that bilateral exchange performs very well in expectation if the file popularity is very concentrated, as was the case when the zip exponent was greater than 1, and if users share a sufficiently large number of files. Now, as it came up a couple of times during the talk, we have taken a static approach. We have considered a time scale where the files that people have or want does not change. But in general, we could, an open question is to study the efficiency properties of bilateral and multilateral exchange in a dynamic setting, where the number of files, as people mentioned here, change over time that people have or that people want, but also users can join and leave the system. So with that, I will stop here and I will be happy to answer any additional questions.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions.
Is there a security twist here if you have, let's say, here you show all users are benign, they exchange files, they pay for them, and so on. If you have a setting where there are malicious users of different profiles,
Yeah, so when we think about incentives and what bad people can do to the system, there are 2 parts to it. One is malicious users who can, let's say, share a file that's not the real file, or try to treat other users like that and say, send a virus instead of a file and so on. We haven't considered that. I mean, for that, you could imagine there could be some security approach to that. We have considered the other part of incentives, which is that we just want people to share the system and what type of incentives work. So if a user is not intrinsically bad, he doesn't want to hurt the system, but he maybe wants to save some of his resources and not share them. This
Selfish.
is the setting we have considered here.
Any other questions?
For future work, what would be the right metric, or what kind of things would you be looking for?
Yeah, so
In the changing
So there has been this study that looks at a private tracker, a private torrent, where they look at, so in this system they try to enforce sharing in a different way. They have these enforced ratios. And they say you should maintain a ratio of 2, which means that the amount you download in bytes should be at most twice what you upload. And so they have done that. And in general, people upload more recent files than old files. But there was this case last year where for some days they allowed them to download any file they wanted for free. So then people, the downloads of old files increased rapidly for that period where it was for free. So there seems to be a big issue in that system, in that if you download old files, you spend some of your ratio there, but then you can, no one else is interested in them, and people do not further share. So I think this attribute of time in popularity is very important. Actually, then I looked at the system and what the recommendations are for new users. They actually tell new users, don't download all files, because then you won't be able to get paid for them. But for me, this doesn't seem that...
Don't download old or old?
Old.
Old.
If you're a new user,
Yeah.
until you build your ratio.
You do the credit card.
Yes, but for me, this is kind of maybe not the best approach, because
There has to be some balance.
this further reinforces the fact that only new stuff is downloaded. So then old stuff becomes
The
even
way
more
you change over
popular.
time, you do exactly that. You change the rule of how much, what's the ratio between what I'm allowed to download versus upload.
Just the way.
So then you get away from the, otherwise you're blocked. Because
Right.
if you have an then nothing happens, the next round. But if you allow me to do more, then over time, maybe it will spread.
But in that case, you actually down to something other people want, but you don't really, you're not particularly interested in it. Wouldn't you end up actually wasting resources?
Yes.
Yes.
So I mean, this has been studied also in this type of bilateral exchange. Also, this is a problem that arises also there. How much more will you get to download for things that you're not interested in, just to enable this type of bilateral exchange? Because we could imagine a setting, I didn't talk about it here, that let's say you are interested in something I have, and John is interested in something you have, and then I want. So we have a cycle to exchange with. Well, potentially we can exchange with each other, and then you use that file to exchange with someone else, even though you didn't really want that file.
Yeah.
So you use that file as a medium of exchange.
It's an intermediate cost that you have for something else.
But obviously there's efficiency loss because you use resources that
Right.
for
The
that.
initial one-to-one actually was motivated a lot by to force some sort of conservative utilization of resources, right? So you don't start using.
I don't know how to do that, I never used it.
Yes. No, this is what I have read in papers about the motivation to go and kind of it.
And how long does this memory last in the
That's another question, right?
But for bookkeeping, you said you need to maintain the ratio of the most books between the upload and download.
Yes.
So how, so when you count the bytes,
So I don't remember the details of the system, but you're given some megabytes at the beginning. It's okay, you can download that. But then if you reach that limit and you also don't have the ratio of 2, you cannot use the system anymore. And the problem in the system
Blocks
that,
you out.
yes, or I mean you could talk to the administrator to give you some extra, but they make it hard. And you could say, okay, I will just log on to a different account, but you cannot do it because actually there is a lot of demand for people to participate in the system. So it's not easy just to restart.
So I cannot do similar kind of thing, right?
Well, I mean,
Personality.
there is a waiting time associated with that. I mean, because you may not be admitted to the system right away. It may take some time.
But going back to Tony's question, I may do this as an attack. I can launch into the system from different computers and a different name.
Yes, but for every name you need to be approved as a user. This is a
Oh,
private
okay.
system.
Okay. Any other questions?
About this Pareto criterion, maybe that's debatable, but I think there is good argument that most people are not interested in Pareto solution. I want to maximize
Yeah.
my utility even if yours goes down. I would like that.
Yes.
So-
No, this is not a goal of a specific
No,
user.
I
It's a
understand
system-wide
why
thing.
is it valued as a criterion since it's not realistic. I mean, you might say that's a fair and nice arrangement in the world where everybody would kind of
Well-
get the best without hurting others, but that's not how people operate.
Okay, it's not really fair. Let me start by that. So let's say an allocation where you have $1 million and I don't have anything is Pareto efficient. Because if you give me any money, it will make you worse off. So it's not a fair allocation. It's just basically a measure to say that there's no way to make people better off without making people worse off.
Why is it?
So let's say you have some utility, and I get some utility from the system. And there's a way to improve my utility without hurting yours. You wouldn't mind moving to this next
Of course.
state, and it would be better for me.
I
So
would
from
like
the
to increase mine even if yours hurts.
yes, but that's fine. That would be
Well, I mean, if we agree that's how people play,
That would not be an
then
equilibrium.
the Pareto optimality is sort of an academic criteria.
That is not equilibrium.
Yeah, it's not an equilibrium.
It's not equilibrium if you can do this kind
No, I
of.
mean, proving that this equilibrium has a Pareto optimality probably is another story.
You missed a beautiful talk by Joe Monday on many of these issues. So what is an acceptable solution and so on and so forth.
It's not a question of acceptable.
In
It's
the
not-
conference.
I mean, you like to model the way
we
people
discussed that in the
actually
conference.
behave.
Yeah, in
And
the
they don't
conference, yeah.
behave anywhere near
Yeah, but
Pareto
there was-
optimality.
But this is an aggregate thing of behavior. So, I mean, that's why it's the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which says in an economy where everyone behaves in his own interest, there's a known set of prices. Everyone just tries to maximize his utility given the prices. Well, it turns out the allocation will be Pareto efficient, which is a good thing for society. If actually the assumptions of if there is no price
Not
discrimination.
even
So,
that.
sorry.
It's not even good for society. As you said before, one can have 1 million and somebody else has
Depends
nothing.
which
Well,
society. It depends.
But okay, but it's better than a setting, let's say, yeah, you have
If
a
you got
million and
nice.
have nothing. It's better than a setting where you have 900,000 and I have nothing. And then,
It's better
the rest is
rich
lost.
and healthy than
Can I
poor and sick.
accept a very comment? One should not confuse society with the internet. The internet is supposed to be very equable and very.
No, it is very much like society, actually.
No, not at all.
It's only if you put controls and mechanisms to enforce certain behavior, but the natural behavior of people on the internet, I think, would be very similar to the way you behave in the economy and anywhere else.
I don't think.
Why?
Well, it's a whole discussion of whether you should treat the internet as the rest of society, because for one matter, there's no money there, there's no.
There's a lot of
discount
money there.
Not in the internet unless, anyway, that's, they call internet the great equalizer, and you cannot talk to society as the great equalizer, so that's philosophy. But the point that you raise is not, it's a good point, and people are questioning it. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's end the speaker.